We're glad you could join us again as Dr. Ravi Zacharias and Dr. John Lennox discuss Stephen Hawking's claim that God was not needed for the universe to come into existence. We only scratched the surface in our first video on this topic. There's much more for us to discuss. Dr. Lennox is joining us by phone from Oxford, and Dr. Lennox himself is a scientist and philosopher. So, Dr. Lennox, let me begin with you. If you believe Dr. Hawking's claims, would you see a need to study science?
Well, it would depend which claim that Hawking is making, because he's claiming that what he's got is a final theory. It's very hard for me to put myself in the hypothetical situation of believing his claim, and I'll tell you why. Because the claim is self-contradictory at three different levels. I don't think I've ever met anything like that quite before. I mentioned it earlier. Because there is a law of gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Now, we've already seen the law of gravity, and gravity are not nothing. But listen to the second bit. The universe will create itself. Well, now, if I say X creates Y, what I mean is that I'm presupposing the existence of X to explain the existence of Y. That's common understanding of language. So if I say X creates X, I'm presupposing the existence of X in order to account for the existence of X. And that's self-contradictory, and it's logically incoherent, even if we do, as Hawking does, put X equal to the universe. And that sounds to me like something out of Alice in Wonderland. It's not science.
You know, sorry, John, go ahead.
Yes, you go ahead, Ravi.
No, please finish that thought. I was just going to leapfrog on that one there.
Well, I was just going to say that the question to me was if I believed Hawking's claim, but I can't believe self-contradictory claims. And he sounds very much to me like Peter Atkins, an Oxford colleague, who said, space-time generates its own dust in the process of its own assembly. And I think one of the best comments on it was Keith Ward's comment. He's Regis Professor Emeritus of theology here in Oxford. He says, look, it's logically impossible for a cause to bring about some effect without already being in existence. And then he ends, between the hypothesis of God and the hypothesis of a cosmic bootstrap, there's no competition. We were always right to think that persons or universes who seek to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps are forever doomed to failure. And that seems to be the heart of the matter, Ravi.
It's absolutely right, John. And you are familiar with John Conwell,
yes.
Who's the director of Cambridge Science and Human Dimension Project at Jesus College in Cambridge. And his comment, which is rather fascinating, in commenting on Hawking's conclusion, he says, dare I suggest that it be the oracular Professor Hawking who is failing to keep up with the philosophers and the theologians rather than the other way around. You know, I would actually go push this comment even further back. You go back all the way back to the days of Aquinas, and the idea of, the three possibilities of uncaused, self-caused, or caused by another. And you've just taken us through that. To be self-caused, you'd have to exist before the effect. To be uncaused, you'd have to have a total existence of nothing, no thing, which something even Aristotle couldn't define when he said it's that which rocks dream about, bringing in the existence of a rock in order to talk of a dream. And so you get the uncaused and self-caused as actually ending up in some form of contradiction. It has to be the caused by another. And what Einstein said in the convergence of three ultimate realities, to him actually, he talked about music, the laws of nature, and, quote, God or mind. I think he had that reverence for the possibility that something greater than merely a law was at work, and he was willing to take that step back and leave it in time and discovery. For absolute negation of this sort, to me, is nothing more than gimmickry and defies both science and logic.
Yes, it does indeed. And I think you hit there, Ravi, on a very important thing. At the very minimal level, what we're saying is this: there's got to be something more. Why is there something rather than nothing? And Hawking actually has failed to answer that question.
But I remember listening to him, as I'm sure you did too, on more occasions than I did, John. And some of his views that he's propounded here actually have been along in his mind for a long time, and then now sort of in a co-authorship bringing this about. I remember listening to him at the Lady Mitchell Hall in 1990 when he was talking about determinism, because he found his own theory leading him to the unbreakable stranglehold of determinism. And at that point, I remember a question coming from the floor: how do you break free from determinism if naturalism is all you have to start with? And I remember him ending his talk with these words, and literally a groan going through the audience. He said, yes, we are all determined, but since we don't know what is determined, we may as well not be. That's the only way he sort of provided an escape hatch to sort of keep pursuing, even though everything was determined and all was by design moving towards an inescapable end with no mind ultimately behind it.
That's right. Oddly enough, you didn't know this. I was at that lecture.
Is that right?
we were in the same room at the same time.
And you remember that well, don't you? Yeah, happening.
I do indeed.
Yeah.
And the very interesting thing is that he has brought this scientific determinism back into this book, and says the book is based on scientific determinism. And he says it's hard to see how free will can operate if our behavior is determined by physical law. And that it seems, and this is a quote, we are no more than biological machines, and free will is just an illusion. Now, that strikes me as very interesting indeed, because, of course, if he's as determined as he claims to be, then that takes all meaning away from the book he's just written that's supposed to convince us of that particular theory.
Right on, John. This is it. It's even if everything he's saying is true, it becomes a self-defeating endeavor, because then truth as a category is evicted, and he is hardwired to come to this conclusion.
I like to put it this way, Ravi, sometimes. You know, people say to me, you say that because you're an Irishman. and what they're committing is the genetic fallacy. Because they can give some sort of what they think is deterministic explanation, therefore what I say is of no value. Now, that's exactly what's happening here. And it's very interesting to see what a very eminent theoretical physicist, because that, of course, is what Hawking is, John Polkinghorne has to say. And he says this: in the opinion of many thinkers, human freedom is closely connected with human rationality. If we were deterministic beings, what would validate the claim that our utterance constituted rational discourse? Would not the sounds issuing from mouths or the marks we made on paper be simply the actions of automata? And then he says this: all proponents of deterministic theories, whether social and economic, Marx, or sexual, Freud, or genetic, Dawkins and E.O. Wilson, and he might well now add, or physics, Hawking, they need a covert disclaimer on their own behalf, accepting their own contribution from reductive dismissal.
Yeah, this is exactly what Berlinski strikes at too in his writings.
He does.
Yeah, I think this very end, I can just hear Dr. Polkinghorne saying this, having taken one of his great courses in quantum out there. This is the proviso they give for themselves while still asserting an absolute that really does not legitimize that proviso. I think the dangerous ground here to me, John, is so immense. We're really going back in some ways to psychological theories of the 60s and so on. If you remember, I remember at that point B.F. Skinner's book Beyond Freedom and Dignity. Same kind of ground will have to be traversed again. What are we going to do with the criminal? What are we going to do with choices?
It's a form of reductionism, of course, that actually undermines not only belief in God, that goes with the turf, but it undermines the rationality that we need to do science. So that what Hawking is doing in suggesting, for instance, as he does explicitly in the book, that human beings are nothing but molecules and atoms. This is back to Francis Crick and the astonishing hypothesis. But if it were true, how would we know it?
Yeah, and I think the word you use is key. That was my first reaction when I was reading his interview, and that was completely reductionistic. And then, of course, when he has to invoke some of the other Crick ideas that therefore a spaceship from somewhere will bring these other entities to us somehow and bring this all to a conclusion and understanding that there are other minds in the universe, so forth, it becomes something that is so beyond the pale of science that it seems to me almost ideologically driven, much more than scientifically driven, and that ideology reduces us to that bare minimum. What does this do of things like the value of human life? What does this do for something like the nature of love? The commitment of a parent to a child, the supererogatory acts of jumping into swirling waters to rescue somebody who cannot rescue themselves. All of these are suddenly put into nothing more than deterministic behavior without putting them into the category of love and nobility and truth and beauty and goodness.
Yes, and one of the causes of that, of course, is this scientism that really there is no other discipline that gives rise to truth. And by funneling everything into that narrow field and not realizing, as other people have realized, that there are certain very big issues that science cannot deal with. It may be very good at describing the motion of the planets, but it can't deal with their beauty. It's good at telling us perhaps how neurons work, but cannot tell us about love. And as Einstein says, you know, and I like this quote very much, you can talk about the ethical foundations of science, but you can't talk about the scientific foundations of ethics. That science has nothing to say about ethics. And it's this all-encompassing belief that science can give us everything that leads to reductionism that, in the end, devalues human life.
I remember the famous rock musician saying, "Knowledge is a deadly friend when no one sets the rules. The fate of all mankind, I see, is in the hands of fools. Confusion will be my epitaph as I crawl a cracked and broken path. And if we make it, we can all sit back and laugh, but I'm afraid tomorrow I'll be crying." Musicians can extend the ideas of philosophy and science and bring it to a knife-edge feeling of reality. How far we've come from the days of Michael Polanyi and his reminder in Personal Knowledge that we must have a healthy respect for how we even arrive at deductive inferences drawn from the sciences, or we move into a terrain that is delegitimized by the very constrictions of the discipline.
It's very hard for me to put myself in the hypothetical situation of believing his claim, and I'll tell you why. Because the claim is self-contradictory at three different levels. I don't think I've ever met anything like that quite before. I mentioned it earlier. Because there is a law of gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Now, we've already seen the law of gravity, and gravity are not nothing. But listen to the second bit. The universe will create science.
You know, sorry, John, go ahead.
Yes, you go ahead,
No,
Ravi.
no, please finish that thought. I was just going to leapfrog on that one there.
Well, I was just going to say that the question to me was if I believed Hawking's claim, but I can't believe self-contradictory claims. And he sounds very much to me like Peter Atkins, an Oxford colleague, who said, space-time generates its own dust in the process of its own assembly. And I think one of the best
needed for the universe to come into existence. We only scratched the surface in our first video on this topic. There's much more for us to discuss. Dr. Lennox is joining us by phone from Oxford, and Dr. Lennox himself is a scientist and philosopher. So, Dr. Lennox, let me begin with you. If you believe Dr. Hawking's claims, would you see a need to study science?
Well, it would depend which claim that Hawking is making, because he's claiming that what he's got is a final theory.
We're glad you could join us again as Dr. Ravi Zacharias and Dr. John Lennox discuss Stephen Hawking's claim that God was not
itself. Well, now, if I say X creates Y, what I mean is that I'm presupposing the existence of X to explain the existence of Y. That's common understanding of the language. So if I say X creates X, I'm presupposing the existence of X in order to account for the existence of X. And that's self-contradictory, and it's logically incoherent, even if we do, as Hawking does, put X equal to the universe. And that sounds to me like something out of Alice in Wonderland. It's not.